Hello, everyone. I'm Nastassia,
And I'm Daniela.
and this week's theme is novel ecologies. So the first article is by Karwick and Wunderlich, and it's a 2017 paper entitled Plant Population Success Across Urban Ecosystems, a framework to inform biodiversity conservation in cities. The main themes that stood out to me, and I'll highlight a few of them, is biodiversity conservation in urban ecosystems. And that's natural remnants, hybrids, immature novel and mature novel ecosystems, urbanization and species adaptation, because biodiversity conservation is not just about the quantities of species variety, but also about population establishment. And the Berlin dataset, which showed that different systems presented different reproduction barriers for native and endangered species in urban ecosystems. So key quotations. One that stood out was this quote that's noted here. Basically, it says that we need to ensure that studies tell the whole story about biodiversity because policies are directly influenced by them. So in terms of the relation to previous material or experiences, this article made me think about our recent Beltline site visit and if there were any studies commissioned by the city. And there was a 2013 study, actually, which I probably should have read before my site visit. But an area of focus of the study of the Beltline appeared to have been on eradicating invasive species as opposed to populating native species. So that's interesting. So we'll move on to the strengths now. So strengths of this article are that the data set gave strong evidence and shifted the article from theoretical to practical. And the Berlin study supports the author's argument about the importance of having the real story about urban biodiversity studies. So now we'll move on to the weaknesses. So they definitely needed more data sets and research from different regions. And also Venn diagrams can only go so far. And I was very confused by a lot of the content of this article, and I had to get a little creative in trying to understand it. So I ended up getting help from the Lord of the Rings and the Ents. So just a bit of backstory for those who never watched this awesome fantasy trilogy. The Treebeard is an Ent, and he's pictured here. And the Ents are the oldest living creatures in Middle Earth. And these are massive trees that can walk and talk. The Ents are ancient and are found in Fangorn forest. So what I ended up doing is superimposing Treebeard and Fangorn over an image of Toronto and asking myself questions like, so what if Treebeard is a native species in a remnant within the GTA? What does that mean? And this graphic actually helped me to understand it. So this then led me to my belief that maps or other imagery of some kind like this would be quite useful for articles like this. So we'll move on to the next article now. Novel and Designed Ecosystems by Eric Higgs and published in 2016. So the main themes that stood out are restoration ecology, which is reversing the degradation of ecosystems to regain their ecological functions, and novel ecosystems and designed ecosystems, which are distinguished by certain characteristics. And this distinction is useful in focusing restoration activity. So a key quotation that is noted here is, in short, paraphrasing, Higgs is saying that the area needs a little less conversation and a little more action. I'm going to leave it there and I'm going to move on to strengths and weaknesses. So for strengths, Higgs established his own list of characteristics for defining novel and designed ecosystems, which were easy to understand, so that was great. And then examples were presented of both ecosystem classifications, as well as restoration opportunities, which was actually helpful. So for weaknesses, the first page of the article, which mostly consisted of current debates and discussion, it was confusing to me. And a few theories and terms were not clearly explained. So for example, there was no clear definition of restoration of ecology. And it's unclear to me if Higgs's stance is that restoration ecology is an overarching approach or not. Still not quite sure. So relating to previous material, Higgs's call to action reminds me of the Jennings et al. Paper that discusses the need for more focused research studies that examine implications of social justice on urban ecology. So now Daniela will introduce the Barris article.
Maris wrote this article in 2010, and it's titled "The New Normal." Maris discusses the novel ecosystems that have the potential to provide benefits to conservation management, and explains that as a result of the Anthropocene, novel ecosystems have become an inevitable part of natural environments. Maris suggests that rather than fighting to maintain an unattainable ideal for pristine native ecosystems, to instead use a new approach that involves also working with novel ecosystems.
So two key quotations that stood out in the article are first, Kariva's, where he says, to think that there is some kind of Garden of Eden, pristine ecosystem, there is none. And he's saying that looking at novel ecosystems through an historical lens is counterproductive. And then Mascaro's quote, where he's asking us if we value maintaining a historical inventory of species, or if we value studying species evolution in a dynamic system. So that's actually an interesting question when we think about this changing world that we're in.
On the strengths, Maris highlights the various benefits novel ecosystems provide to native species. She also describes both sides of the debate, those that are for and those that are against novel ecosystems. On the weaknesses, the article is limited to tropical climates, specifically Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and there's also not enough studies on novel ecosystems, therefore more research is needed.
So relating to previous material or experiences, I was reminded of Foreman's 2016 article where he discusses using natural ecosystem principles to understand the modern global surface, and that this is actually counterproductive. And also, the Puerto Rican pine forest mentioned in the article reminds me of the super invasive pine forests in the Bahamas. And these forests radically change the ecosystems of many of our islands. And even though now they're known for great bird watching, what about the species that these pine forests completely wiped out? That's a question that we'll have to answer at some point. So now Daniela will discuss the Silva podcast.
This podcast is titled Look Who's Coming to Dinner, Bacteria That Eat the Goannas Sludge. And it was done in 2016 by Silva. In this podcast, Silva discusses the Gowanus Canal in New York City, which is a trench polluted by toxic waste and chemicals from industrial facilities and sewage. Discovered in the sludge at the bottom of the Gowanus Canal are new communities of microorganisms capable of biologically processing pollutants. Silva highlights the BK Bioreactor project, which has been conducting microbiome analysis of sediment samples in the Gowanus Canal. Key quotation is the canal, our findings and potential design interventions opens doors to new ways of conceiving both nature and cities, and could point the way toward innovative cleanup strategies for the future. The strengths of this podcast are that it explains the science behind the method, how bacteria have acquired the remediation functions, and how the bacteria can be used in remediation. It's also one solution for eliminating toxic waste in natural environments. The weaknesses, I would say, are that it would take many years for the bacteria to completely rid the canal of all its pollutants. It may not be the best form of remediation for extensively damaged areas. And also the bacteria live in the sludge at the bottom of the canal. Therefore, it is not known whether this remediation method could be implemented in other ecosystems on land, for example, in soil, and ecosystems in water, for example, rivers, lakes, and oceans. Relating the themes to previous material, If we think back to raccoon resistance by the 99% Invisible podcast, the raccoons are providing an environmental benefit by consuming the organic waste from the green bins. Not only are they reducing waste, they're also reducing the amount of methane gas that will be emitted by rotting waste, making the air cleaner. Similarly, the microorganisms in the Gowanus Canal are degrading pollutants through bioremediation, which is making the water cleaner. Therefore, it is beneficial to look to the natural world for sustainable design solutions of managing waste. And another example is just to give you a little bit of history here, in the 1860s, the area near the Gowanus Canal became a hub for manufacturing and shipping. So chemicals, sewage, and waste were dumped directly into the canal. Then in the late 1940s, the neighborhood of Gowanus became the site of several housing projects for mainly low-income New Yorkers. This relates back to the Gosin and Lial podcast discussing environmental injustices as a systemic problem in which low-income and marginalized communities are disproportionately affected by environmental hazards. These communities often have no recourse, so they are forced to live in areas such as Gowanus that are unsafe to their health and well-being. Now on to the Angelovsky article, which was written in 2013, and it is titled New Directions in Urban Environmental Justice, Rebuilding Community, Addressing Trauma and Remaking Place. Angelovsky challenges traditional understandings and boundaries of environmental justice scholars and puts forth a more positive outlook on environmental justice studies, where residents and community activists take proactive measures to improve their neighborhoods by creating an urban environment that is sustainable, livable, and resilient. Angelovsky advocates for a place-based urban environmental justice approach, which is a framework for analyzing environmental justice initiatives in cities, ensuring that they support physical and mental health, community rebuilding, and place remaking for marginalized communities. Now, a key quotation from this article is when Angelovsky emphasizes that environmental justice and community development must not be separated. Environmental revitalization projects strengthen the community and provide a mechanism for remaking place and nurturing the community from within. The strengths of this article are that it advocates for a proactive rather than reactive method. It also includes cities with a diverse range of political systems, level of citizen engagement, and socioeconomic statuses. And this approach nurtures the physical, emotional, and psychological well-being of marginalized communities and encourages community engagement. For weaknesses, the author's research is limited to the areas of Dudley, Cask Antic, and Cayo Hueso. It also may not be possible to extrapolate the application of this method to other communities and cities because it is dependent on a lot of different variables. And finally, the author does not fully address the influence of government, policies, systemic racism, and corporate interests as impediments to this approach, specifically due to the fact that government and industry have a lot of power. Now, how the article relates to previous material and experiences, Angelovsky's reading relates to Jennings et al.'s reading by addressing the link between urban green spaces, social justice, and human health. Angelovsky goes a little further by also including the idea of spatial justice and incorporating a holistic, solutions-based approach for creating environmentally and socially just places and spaces. Questions for the class discussion. Number 1, can you think of urban ecosystems locally or internationally that, if left alone, can be amenable to restoration? Number 2, are there any examples of natural remnants in Toronto or the GTA? If so, where are they located? Number 3, what other sustainable design solutions are available for managing and removing waste in natural environments? Number 4, how can residents of marginalized communities who live, learn, work, and play in those places and spaces be involved in the decision-making processes over land use planning and policy development. Thank you for listening.